Ready. Okay, welcome everybody to CSIS. My name is Moises Rendon. I'm the director of the Future of Venezuela Initiative and fellow of the Americas program. Unfortunately, due to last minute travel issues, Joanna Mendelsohn from American University, who was gonna join us for this panel, is not gonna be able to make it anymore. I would like to mention that we're mindful that this is an all-male panel and that we're doing as much as possible to include women in our events. Especially when we discuss Venezuela, we like to focus on how the various crises in Venezuela affects men and women differently. And it's important to address how solutions can be beneficial to all Venezuelans. We're discussing today a very timely topic, the implications of invoking the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance, known as the Rio Treaty, or TIAR for its initials in Spanish. Just for a quick background, the United States and 11 other Western Hemisphere nations invoked the TIAR, the Rio Treaty, to facilitate a regional response to the crisis in Venezuela. As a first step, on September 23rd of 2019, 16 out of the 19 member countries voted and agreed to impose targeted sanctions on individuals and entities associated with the government of Nicolás Maduro. They also pledged to meet again within 2 months to discuss additional measures. I think these deliberations have potential implications for US policy. This is why we're here to walk us through all of these implications on what the Rio Treaty means and how this affects the crisis, right? So, and this is not only a timely issue because interim President Juan Guaidó is meeting with world leaders at Davos as we speak, but also because the treaty sheds some light on what is left in the policy toolkit, right, on Venezuela, because we already have done so much. But this treaty particularly kind of gives room to more options, and that's where we want to get into. So I think there are two big questions for this discussion that I want to make sure that every single one in the room leaves with clarity and some answers to those two big questions. The first one, basics, what is the Rio Treaty and what are its implications in addressing the Venezuelan crisis? The second question is, what is different from the Rio Treaty compared to sanctions and diplomatic measures that we already have imposed today to the Maduro regime? So how the Rio Treaty makes our international response differently? We have a great panel today to tackle those questions. Thank you all ambassadors for joining. You all have their bios with you, so I wouldn't go through them. But again, I want to thank ambassadors, two permanent ambassadors to the OEAS, and Ambassador Brownfield to join us for this timely discussion. Ambassador Tarre, we will start with you. Thank you again for joining. The floor is yours.
I want to begin by thanking CSIS and especially Moises Rendon and his team for hosting this event. The Rio Treaty, known in Spanish, as Moises said, as TIAR, has become an important tool to the interim government of Juan Guaidó and of its international campaign against Maduro and his criminal regime. Venezuela denounced the TIAR under the presidency of late Hugo Chavez in 2012, claiming that it was an imperialist instrument of the United States. On June 23rd of last year, the National Assembly of Venezuela approved our reincorporation to the treaty. Since then, we have convened a meeting of consultation of foreign ministers and implemented 2 resolutions aimed at eroding Maduro support base. Despite these diplomatic achievements, we cannot escape reality. Maduro remains in power, Maduro is still there, and his regime shows little signs of abandoning its dictatorial ways. The treaty was conceived in a very different era. At that time, the world was settling after World War II, and the conflicts were fought by states in battlefields, in conventional battlefields. Economies were smaller, the world was far less connected, and the most important technological advancement in the field of communication were of very difficult access and controlled by few countries or a few companies. We now live in an era of conflict between states and non-state actors. That's new. And there are new technologies too. The globalization of criminal enterprises like drug cartels have allowed the rise of organizations that rival the world's largest corporations. We can say the same about terrorist organizations, which have activities not limited by the state borders. Terrorist groups such as the FARC, the ELN, and Hezbollah, which have proven to be worthy adversaries for regional and global powers, are now operating in Venezuela. Furthermore, we live in a world where a small group of people with access to the internet technology can weaponize public opinion and influence the masses at a very, very low cost. This is evidence of a global disinformation war that is more efficient than traditional propaganda. The world has seen a proliferation of fake sites, user accounts, or content that target the public with divisive messages. Last Sunday, Moises Naim wrote in the Spanish newspaper El País, "We have seen how Russian hackers or sponsored by Russia have learned to sow confusion in the societies to create doubts about what or who to believe, to deepen the differences and conflicts that already exist, or invent new ones, to promote some political actor and destroy the reputation of others. All this they can do, and they do, not only in their neighboring countries, but in any country in the world. Hackers and Russian bots have intervened in Catalonia, Brexit, Germany, France, Estonia, Georgia, Ukraine, and a lot of more countries. But it's not only the advanced use of what the Russian government calls political technologies. They also have the ability to use cyber weapons to attack the electrical networks, telecommunication, transportation, or financial infrastructure in another country. A few days ago, last Sunday, Lara Jakes, the New York Times diplomatic correspondent, wrote that watching political unrest explode across South America this fall, officials of the State Department noticed a nearly similar pattern in anti-government protests that otherwise had little in common. In Chile, nearly 10% of all tweets supporting protests in late October originated with Twitter accounts that had a high certainty of being linked by Russia. In Bolivia, immediately after President Evo Morales resigned on November 10, the number of tweets associated with those type of accounts spiked to more than 1,000 a day, up from fewer than 5 a day. And in Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Colombia, and Chile, over one 30-day period, Russia-linked accounts posted a strangely similar message with 90 minutes of one another. An analysis by the Atlantic Council done in the first quarter of 2019 showed that Russia Today in Spanish garnered nearly 100 million visits in 1 month. These outlets not only spread misinformation, but mobilized public opinion to destabilize regional government, and in 1 month, Russia had access to 1/10 of the population of the region and provide them with news and entertainment. This reign to gain influence over Latin America, which was once through coups and revolution, has now moved to social media where anybody can be reached. However, Russia is not solely responsible for the social and security issues in the region. They have tapped legitimate reasons of social unrest. Maduro also deserves a large share of the blame. The massive output of migrants with severe needs to the region has put its already fragile social peace in crisis. Maduro hopes that will force his neighbors to focus on domestic policy instead of pushing for his ouster. Perhaps as worrisomely is the means through which he ensured the regime's survival. He has allied himself with notorious drug cartels, criminal gangs, and terrorist groups, granting them safe haven in exchange for their help in the defense of the so-called revolution. This had serious repercussions for the people of Venezuela, especially those who live in border states and in the mineral-rich areas south of the Orinoco River. There, paramilitary groups extort farmers for protection from or worse, while criminal gangs fight an all-out war for the mineral resources which they exploit to finance their activities. The TIAR doesn't take into account this new form of war. The possibility of attacking a country can assume ways that did not exist in 1947, nor the possibility of a government co-opted by an illegitimate ruler, coordinating with non-state actors to create a domestic and foreign condition for its survival. In this context, we conceive that the Maduro regime represents a credible threat to the stability of the region as stated in the treaty. The TIAR presents itself as a tool with the potential to channel multilateral solutions to this new kind of regional problems. However, as with any tool, it needs to be updated to reflect the defense needs of the 21st century. This means being creative about the action to take to deal with the unprecedented issues we face. We need to open to new ideas, to think outside the box. The cost of not doing so is far too great. A hemisphere in constant crisis and the resources of one of the richest regions of the world, funding criminal gangs, terrorist groups, and destabilizing movement. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Tarek. Okay, you cover a lot of information. I'm writing down what are the key points that we want to go back to because there's a lot of here. Ambassador Simas, thank you so much, Ambassador, for joining. How do you see the TIAR Rio Treaty playing into the Venezuelan crisis?
Thank you, Moises. I want to thank you for the invitation, CSIS, and it's a pleasure for me to join with Ambassadors Brownfield and Gustavo Tarek this afternoon. Some of my colleagues are also here. Thank you for being together with us. So Ambassador Tarek has provided some context. I think it's very appropriate that he did so. And I will try to address in very short remarks why we consider that TIAR continues to be a valuable tool for us for exerting pressure and attaining some of our political and strategic objectives in the region. And at the same time, these remarks are structured around what we consider to be three main misperceptions about the TIAR. So we'll address those very shortly, and then of course I'm open to a Q&A after we finish here. So I think it's fair to say, to begin with, that the treaty, the Rio Treaty, recently has one of the most commented international legal instruments, at least for us in the Americas. And as I said, probably, I think it's unfair, but probably the Rio Treaty is perhaps misunderstood and has a very bad reputation. And discussions on the matter of the application of the Rio Treaty are usually hampered by the three misperceptions that I mentioned. First, the first misperception, that the Rio Treaty is an instrument for military intervention, narrowly for military intervention. Now, the Rio Treaty has been applied to at least 20 situations since it entered into force in 1948. My colleagues in the mission have helped me in putting together a brief summary of these 20 different situations in which we have invoked the treaty. In none of these situations did a military intervention effectively take place or the use of force. Of course, we can make here a disclaimer regarding the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, because there was a resolution that authorized the use of force, although it never took place like that. But we certainly have to make this disclaimer, because there was a resolution in 1962 that actually authorized the use of force to contain the situation in Cuba. This resolution, however, never reached the Security Council of the United Nations, so it was never actually put entirely into force. It served, of course, as leverage, a political leverage, military leverage, and helped contain the situation and finally resolve it, but it was resolved through other means, not under the umbrella of the TIAR necessarily. Now, the majority of situations referred essentially to traditional threats involving two or more member states of the Organization of American States. And these situations, in general, address invasion of territory or interference in domestic affairs. And only in 4 cases had the Rio Treaty been applied to address issues that involved an extracontinental threat. The case of Cuba, as I mentioned, in 1962, which involved threats resulting from the association of the Cuban government at the time with the Soviet bloc. The question of the Malvinas Islands in 1982, involving the United Kingdom, of course, and the 9/11 terrorist attacks in 2001. Before the situation in Venezuela, 2001 was the previous case in which we invoked the TIAR. So it was, for all purposes, inactive for a long time. So far, my contention here is that far from being an instrument for military intervention, the Rio Treaty is an effective mechanism for peaceful mediation of conflicts. It sounds perhaps a little awkward to say so, but it's actually how, if you look in perspective, in historical perspective, you will agree with me. In the case of the present Venezuelan crisis, the use of force is not on the table, although it is a measure foreseen in the treaty. You will find the authorization for use of force as one of the provisions in the treaty. In this specific instance, treating the situation in Venezuela, we have not considered the adoption of measures involving the use of force. Now, the second misperception is that the Rio Treaty is anachronistic. Now, the most common perception of the Rio Treaty is that it is an outdated byproduct of the Cold War, and that it should not exist anymore, or that it's not useful now as a tool for its member states. And it's true, to be fair, that the Rio Treaty was designed as a collective defense mechanism in the context of the Cold War. And it was effective when it was used and applied to at least situations like the one in Cuba, when Cuba acted as a proxy to the Soviet Union. Then, nonetheless, as mentioned before, the vast majority of these cases, of the cases where the Rio Treaty was applied, referred, as I said, to traditional threats involving 2 or more countries of the hemisphere, with no direct relation to the Cold War. And if you look at the 20 situations that I mentioned, the reference to the Cold War perhaps only was more clear in the situation involving Cuba in 1962. So the Rio Treaty in practice, as we see it, is a broad legal basis that can be applied to a set of different situations. It covered not only extra-hemispheric threats and conflicts among countries of the regions, it is also open to situations, as it's stated in Article 6, where the inviolability or the integrity of the territory or the sovereign political independence of an American state should be affected by an aggression, which is not an armed attack, or even broader definition, by any other fact or situation that might endanger the peace of the Americas. That is a provision in the treaty. Those situations, which are reflected, as I said, in Article 6, are the basis for the 2 latest situations which justified, in our view, the application of the Rio Treaty, the 9/11 terrorist attacks and the present case of Venezuela. So far from being anachronistic, we consider the Rio Treaty to be a dynamic, up-to-date legal instrument that survived the Cold War and continues to prove to be a very useful tool for us as an inter-American mechanism. Now, to conclude, the third misperception is that the Rio Treaty is a panacea for addressing the political crisis in Venezuela. We need to be clear about this. The Rio Treaty was not designed to put an end to authoritarian regimes, nor to pacify societies. Neither it is intended necessarily as a means to restore democracy in any given country. So what is the role of the Rio Treaty in the Venezuelan crisis? In my humble opinion, the main purpose of the Rio Treaty is to address the threats that the Maduro regime poses to security and stability in the region. It aims to address security impacts in the region as a consequence of the criminal state that has been installed in Venezuela. If you look at the migration crisis, for instance. But Ambassador Tari has referred to much more serious situations, like the free operation of terrorist and criminal gangs inside the Venezuelan territory, which is obviously a source of major concern for neighboring partner countries. The two resolutions that we have adopted so far in the constitutional organ of the Rio Treaty established a mechanism to investigate and to punish persons associated with the Maduro regime responsible for transnational organized crime. If you look at the two resolutions, the one in September last year and the most recent one, adopted on 3 December, they established an operation network of agencies that are in charge of investigation, police investigations, money laundering investigations. And this operation network is supposed to bring us with suggestions on how to deal with these situations in a collective manner. The Rio Treaty, therefore, is part of an array of measures to address this multidimensional crisis in Venezuela. It targets one specific and very significant component of the crisis, but the Rio Treaty alone will not restore democracy in Venezuela. This is a task for the Venezuelan people. So, concluding remarks. First, the Rio Treaty is not a panacea for the Venezuelan crisis, but it is a useful tool, crucial instrument to prevent the Maduro regime from continued fooling destabilization in the region. Number two, the Rio Treaty is a legally binding instrument and allows most of the state parties to apply measures that could not otherwise be implemented, like enforcing the travel ban that we have adopted in last December, and that involves 29 figures associated with the Maduro regime. The decision to sanction these 29 persons of the Maduro regime, as I say, illustrates a meaningful measure that could not be implemented in most legal systems of the countries of the hemisphere, but that can now be applied by the state parts of the Rio Treaty, because the Rio Treaty establishes that other than the use of force, all of the decisions adopted by the constitutional organ are mandatory to all of the member states. Then, number three, other measures under Article 8 of the treaty are also on the table. The red line for us has been the use of force, which is not being currently considered as an option. Number four, one important side effect of the Rio Treaty is to contribute to increasing the isolation, the international and regional isolation of the regime, and I think it has proved effective also in that regard. And finally, the treaty is part of a combined measures by the international community, not only in the hemisphere, by the international community as a whole, to assist Venezuelan people in finding their path back to democracy. I'll be available later for your questions. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Great. Well, I think we put into context what's the role of the Rio Treaty in Venezuela. Now we're going to hear from our beloved senior advisor at CSIS, Bill Bramfield. As you know, he was an ambassador to Colombia, Venezuela, and Chile previously. So, Ambassador, what's your thoughts on this issue?
Moises, I'm not just a senior advisor to CSIS. I'm an uncompensated senior advisor to CSIS. Ladies and gentlemen, you have now had the benefit of hearing from two experts on the matter of the TIAR, the Rio Treaty, its history, its applicability. Now let us hear from one who clearly acknowledges he is not an expert, not a lawyer, not familiar with the total history of the Rio Treaty, not even an expert on the Organization of American States. But he does have a brain. He is, after all, from the state of Texas, and he is capable of at least offering some suggestions as to why the Rio Treaty should be a helpful mechanism or tool for the Western Hemisphere and its governments to deal with the Venezuela crisis. And I'll offer 6 reasons. After all, if Ambassador Simas can offer 3, I should be able to offer double that number. First, it is an excellent mechanism for coordination among Western Hemisphere governments because it is a formal legal mechanism. The Lima Group is a superb coordination mechanism, but it is an informal grouping. It does not have legal status, if you will. I personally am strongly in favor of the work of the Lima Group and equally in favor of cooperation through the Rio Treaty mechanism. Second, it strengthens the position, the authorities, the credibility of the Organization of American States. And on matters in this hemisphere, particularly matters related to Venezuela, that is an important positive element. The Rio Treaty, in essence, was promulgated and ratified through the OAS mechanism. Application of the Rio Treaty provides greater strength and greater authority, whether moral or legal or simply perceptions around the world to the OAS. Third, the Rio Treaty is an effective mechanism for messaging other international organizations and NGOs throughout the world as to the seriousness with which the nations of the Western Hemisphere are taking the crisis and the consequences of the crises in Venezuela today. Those international organizations can be the United Nations and its constituent elements, the humanitarian, the economic, the human rights sub-organizations of the United Nations. It can also be regional organizations such as the European Union, the African Union, the other regional organizations spread around the world, and the NGO community would include and incorporate the humanitarian NGOs, the human rights NGOs, the economic NGOs. All of them benefit and receive a message when the nations of the Western Hemisphere talk about their treaty for reciprocal assistance within the hemisphere. Fourth, let us be frank. At some point, as I have said many times over the last 2 years, at some point we know how this book ends in Venezuela. We, in a sense, know how the final chapter ends. What we do not know is how many chapters there will be between now and the end, and how long the final chapter will be. The Rio Treaty serves to some extent as a useful mechanism for talking about, discussing, considering, and even preparing for some form of hemispheric multinational role when the moment arrives that there is some form of transition in Venezuela. It could be as a result of invitation from the government or the interim government then in office in Venezuela, or it could be by unanimous conclusion within the hemisphere that the situation has reached such a level that some form of international cooperation to address it is an important thing. And the Rio Treaty would contribute to an organized and carefully coordinated process should the hemisphere reach that conclusion. And fifth, we have talked, every single one of us have talked about the humanitarian crisis. The fact that somewhere between 5 and 6 million Venezuelan citizens have left their nation as refugees due to the situation at home, and how it is overwhelmingly the nations of the Western Hemisphere that are accepting those refugees and bearing the consequences of those movements. And ladies and gentlemen, if we ever reach the point where, with or without invitation, a decision is reached collectively to provide humanitarian assistance to or within Venezuela, the Rio Treaty is perhaps a more effective formal legal mechanism for both considering and eventually delivering that assistance, should that be the decision. And finally, I conclude the same way I have concluded oh so many of my presentations on Venezuela over the last 2 years. Why do I think the Rio Treaty is a politically effective device or mechanism today? Because, in my opinion, talking about the Rio Treaty and, in fact, applying specific provisions of the Rio Treaty, in my humble opinion, produce sleepless, or at least disturbed sleeping evenings, perhaps, for Mr. Nicolás Maduro, or for his excellent Minister of Defense, Mr. Padrino López. I frankly would argue that anything that has them concerned about what might actually happen, what might finally be decided by the other nations of this hemisphere in terms of the Rio Treaty, is actually a good thing, regardless of what happens. The fact that they are worried about it is good. The fact that they have to take that into account as they assess and determine how they will deal with the opposition, how they will deal with the interim constitutional government or president of the Republic of Venezuela, is a good thing. Ladies and gentlemen, the Rio Treaty is an extremely complicated issue through the last, 74, 73 years of history in the Western Hemisphere. I suggest to you that we should not look upon the Rio Treaty as a tree, and we assess its branches, its leaves, and the veins on the branches, on the leaves. That can take us years and years of discussion. The Rio Treaty, in my metaphor, is a large forest. Walk into that forest, and it will take you in almost any direction you wish to go. Of course, we must have a clear enough sense and understanding of the trees, their branches, their leaves, and the veins on those leaves to know what is permitted or not permitted in the forest. But the forest gives us a multitude of options. Let's keep those options open. With that, Dr. Rendon, I relinquish the floor.
Thank you. Thanks, Ambassador. Great. So, I mean, we have a lot of material here to cover. I would like to go back to Ambassador Tarre and Ambassador Simas, probably connecting to what Ambassador Brownfield was describing as what the Rio Treaty and how can it be helpful, no? I mean, on one hand, we have support by Russia, Iran, China, Cuba on the Maduro regime. Despite that support, Maduro is more isolated than ever before, right? I mean, we have a regime that is sanctioned, that is not recognized as a legitimate government by more than 55 countries, and that has legal, economic, and diplomatic implications moving forward, and we're seeing those playing out every week, every day. But despite that, the Maduro regime has found a way to adapt, to these sanctions and international restrictions. So how all of these tools that we're describing that the Rio Treaty has on the table, and it has had on the table for over 70 years, how these differentiate itself from what we have so far, which are, again, sanctions, diplomatic pressure. We have a coalition of different countries increasing pressure on Maduro in a constant basis. How are these tools on the Rio Treaty can be different, maybe more effective to reach, to reach a safer and a more prosperous Venezuela?
Oh.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree with Ambassador Brownfield in the sense that all the possibilities opened by the treaty must be on the table. As Ambassador Sima said, in the discussions we had in New York and then in Bogota, the majority, all of the countries present around the table were against the use of military force. But what I think is that the military force, as it is stated in the treaty, is a conventional military force, the conventional use of military force. And what I tried to say in my first intervention is that there is new ways of war. The war is not the same today as it was 70 years ago. In the Department of Defense, in the Pentagon, there is a cyber command. This cyber command is acting right now. There is a war. Nobody speaks about that, but in this cyber command, they are fighting against hackers, against the use of misinformation about any kind of new tools that are open by the news technology in order to harm countries. And this kind of war cannot be excluded from the application of the treaty. We have to think about that. It's a new field, but this field, in my sense, is open. The second way that the use of force can be put away is drug traffic. Venezuela is right now one of the most important transit countries of drug in the world. The majority of drug who goes to Europe and to United States goes through Venezuela. And it goes mostly openly. There are restrictions of flights after they leave Venezuela to other countries, mainly to Central America, and very, very few controls about ships that go from Venezuela to all the Western Hemisphere. Therefore, the use of force, of naval force, of a naval blockade of drug traffickers. There is very clear information about which ships are drug transporters and which not. And it should be very easy to naval forces to intercept and to block the drug that came from Venezuela. And that is very important, not only because the drug is a problem of everyone and for every country. It's very important because the drugs benefits, the drugs which came from money of this traffic, is going to finance irregular troops from the Colombian guerrilla who acts from Venezuela. International terrorism, namely Hezbollah, that take a lot of money out of Venezuela and out of drug traffic, which come from Venezuela. That means that the problem is, as Ambassador Brownfield said, extremely complex, but maybe extremely useful if in a fight that is a very global fight against this kind of irregular fighters that appears in the world scenario and that we have to confront in order to preserve freedom and democracy.
Thank you. Thanks, Ambassador. Ambassador Simas, anything to add?
Yeah, shortly. Thank you. I think Ambassador Tari has again mentioned very legitimate aspects of the Venezuelan crisis that justify state parties to the treaty meeting and adopting collective decisions. And I fully support the approach that the treaty continues to be a valid tool to be used in this specific situation. What I would like to address with you is a different element. I mean, there have been several international efforts by different groups of countries that have tried to be helpful and support President Guaido and support a democratic transition in Venezuela. And not only the Lima group, but then after that you had the International Contact Group, you have the Montevideo Mechanism and others that have tried to be helpful in dealing with the situation in Venezuela. In different ways have tried to apply pressure and in different ways leverage their relations with Venezuela in order to help the transition in that country. What I think, to answer your question with this, what I think makes the use of TIAR different is, and this is a very short answer, because it's, as Ambassador Brownfield mentioned, this is a legal framework which makes the decision taken by the state parties mandatory to all of those who are parties to the treaty. And now we have a very important set of two resolutions adopted in the last 6 months, which have put in place very effective and coordinated measures to sanction figures associated with the regime. And I agree with Ambassador Brownfield. They should be extremely worried about the weight of our action in this regard.
Great, thank you. Ambassador Brownfield, you mentioned you're not an expert on the Rio Treaty, as probably 98% of this room. So I'm going
The honest 98%.
I'm going to briefly put into context a couple of relevant articles that I think apply to what we're discussing here in Venezuela, right? And I'm going to allow myself to read them out loud. Just bear with me, because the language is as the tools, the language is a little bit updated, no? Article 6, and Ambassador Tarre, please correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe the meeting in September 2019 was on the basis on Article 6, right? And that's why member countries agreed to pursue on sanctions on Venezuela. Article 6 of the Rio Treaty says, if the inviolability or the integrity of the territory or the sovereignty or political independence of any American state, not in the US, but any American nation in the continent, should be affected by an aggression, which is not an armed attack or extracontinental or intercontinental conflict, or by any other fact or situation, might endanger the peace of America, then the organ of consultation shall meet and discuss what measures should be taken to maintain peace and security in the region, right? I believe that article applies directly to Venezuela. We've seen a lot of 5.3 million refugees coming out of Venezuela, which is affecting Colombia, Brazil, Ecuador, Peru. In a way, the presence of non-state actors like ELN, FARC, dissidents, and others are increasing the insecurity of the region. And there's a lot of narco-trafficking, money laundering, illegal mining. The illegal mining is creating a devastation in the Amazon region. So I believe there are enough reasons to argue that Venezuela is creating instability and is affecting the peace of the region, right? So that's Article 6, and that's where member countries agreed to move forward. However, and this is coming to you, Ambassador Brownfield, so be ready. Articles 8 is also crucial, because Article 8, and again, bear with me, for the purpose of this treaty, the measures on which the organ of consultation may agree will comprise one or more of the following. 1, recall of chiefs of diplomatic missions. 2, breaking of diplomatic relations. 3, breaking of consular relations. 4, partial or complete interruption of economic relations or of rail, sea, air, postal, telegraphic, telephonic, and radio-telegraphic communications, and all of these FATs. and then he says, and use of armed force. So, as Ambassador Sima said, the use of armed force, at least for now, is not on the table in the member countries, but there are a lot of other things that are on the table, that are being discussed, that are part of the Article 8, which of these tools, Ambassador Brownfield, do you think will be effective to keep helping Venezuela on addressing the threat of the peace of the region?
Yep. I mean, Moises, in my opinion, the beauty, the charm of the Rio Treaty is that it is both an ample and yet a flexible document that allows the states party to the treaty to determine which parts of the treaty they choose to apply or enforce, when they will apply or enforce them, and even permits them to change their mind as the situation on the ground changes over time. The importance of the Rio Treaty, as we have all stated, you could almost say ad nauseum now, is that it is a legal document and a legal structure. That said, it is not a straitjacket. It does not say, once we have invoked the Rio Treaty, we all must do every single element that is in the treaty. I mean, the drafters of the treaty, 75 years ago, I think, were wise enough to indicate these are possibilities or options that are permitted or could be implemented under the terms. But it is the states' parties and their representatives, their leaders, their governments that make that determination. You know as well as I do, you more than anyone else in this room, Moises, know that I would be comfortable applying a great number of the authorities that are permitted in the Rio Treaty. However, since I am not an idiot, I also realize that there are many, many people in this hemisphere, probably at this stage a majority, who believe that some of the authorities that could be potentially applied are not yet ripe for consideration and certainly not ripe for application. That is fine. In my opinion, the message for Mr. Maduro and his government, the message for the other international organizations in the world, the message for governments that are playing, as far as this hemisphere is concerned, an unhelpful role in Venezuela, is the following. The Rio Treaty is now in play. You might want to read it if you want to see what options are available to the governments of this hemisphere should we ever reach the point where we feel we must apply those options. That would be my answer to the question.
No, thank you, Ambassador. Okay, Ambassador Tarre, and I want to make sure that we have time for Q&A. I promise you we will have about 25 minutes for Q&A from you, so just be patient. Ambassador Tarre, I mean, one of the things I like about this Rio Treaty is that it addresses not only a political crisis, right? It addresses a crisis that is affecting the stability and the peace of the region, which is the case of Venezuela, and that's very important to understand. I mean, some of you already, some of our friends already are mentioning this all the time. To get a solution on Venezuela, you have to have the right diagnostic first, right? The diagnostic, or part of the diagnostic, this is a state that is controlled by organized crime and criminal activities, and therefore any solution that needs to address those issues first, right? And that's where I like the Rio Treaty, because it's a mechanism a multilateral legal mechanism to address not a political but a security matter. Ambassador Brownfield said that a humanitarian aid should be a priority, right? I mean, we have people dying and suffering just because of lack of food. Amazing. Ambassador Tarre, how do you see applying the Rio Treaty in implementing some sort of humanitarian response to this crisis, and how that will affect the peace and the security moving forward?
Yes, I agree with Ambassador Brownfield that the treaty is open to a very large choices of action. And as Moises read in the text of Article 6, the main part of this article is the danger to the hemispheric peace, the peace in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas. And that's a very wide field for the application of this treaty. And in Article 8, the possibility, some of them are named and are as a consequence of the times. The radioelectric and radiophonics communication doesn't exist anymore. But the idea is there, is communication. And the idea of diplomatic representation has to be seen with very, very carefully, because the existence of foreign embassies in Caracas is absolutely necessary for the people who support Juan Guaidó. We have refugees in several embassies in Caracas that, if this embassy were closed, should be now in prison, in jail. Therefore, we have to read the treaty in a very smart way. I think it's possible. And Moises, in his question, opens another way, which is very interesting. We have a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. People are starving. There is a problem of lack of medicines. And there are a lot of possibilities of helping Venezuelan people, but the Maduro regime doesn't allow this aid to come inside Venezuela. How to push the food and medicine inside Venezuela? There are ways, the possibility of no-flight zones. That's the use of military forces, but the use, a non-conventional use of military forces that have to be think about. We have to think about this kind of solution, Moises. And I think that the most important for this time is to be open of considering all these solutions. In Syria, there have been the use of force in order to give food and medicine to people, to starving people, to sick people. And that has not been, in my opinion, discussed in length among the state part of the treaty. And I am personally absolutely open of this kind of solution. And there may be many more, because I am a lawyer, and I am an old lawyer, and I think that the very old lawyers were very, very good. The people who wrote this treaty were very, very smart. And it's a marvel. Read by a lawyer, the tragedy of our time is that we don't have treaties like this one, and we see a lot of legal text that have a lot of holes, a lot of interpretation, a lot of misinterpretation, and the Rio Treaty is a marvel in this sense. It's very, very well written, and it opens a lot of possibilities inside the legal frame that is established by the treaty.
Do we have a date for the next meeting when it's going to happen?
Yes, around the March 20 of this year.
March 20?
In 2 months.
In Washington.
In Washington.
In Washington.
Yes.
Is that the same date? I'm sorry. Is that the same date for the new election, for the election of the new Secretary General of the OAS?
Yes, we try to, as the Foreign Affairs Minister are going to be here.
Oh, okay. So you're going to do two things at
okay,
that makes sense. That's good for all of us. Ambassador Simmons, any reactions so far before we open it up the floor?
Thank you. Well, this has been very interesting discussion, and I really enjoyed the opportunity to join with you. First, on Article 8, we, as state parties to the treaty, we have not precluded resort to any of the measures. Now, we have to be very realistic also when we look at the way the treaty has operated in these 2 last meetings. 5 or 6 countries that are state parties to the treaty have agreed to participate if they were given some sort of assurance or reassurance that the use of force would not be on the table. Any resolution in the treaty to be adopted needs 13 votes. So I want you to take that and bear that in mind when we are building a number of countries that support adopting certain measures. We need to reach that threshold of 13 countries that support those. And that's what we have done in the last 2 meetings. And if you look at the recent meeting in December, when we have agreed to enforce a travel ban involving 29 figures associated with the Maduro regime, that specific resolution had 13 votes. So we are very carefully threading among the majority of members of the treaty that support a certain line of action. So I agree with Ambassador Brownfield that the beauty is that other measures are available, but we also need to look at the fact that we need those 13 votes in order to adopt any other measure. So that's what we are doing. We are taking a step-by-step approach, proving first that the treaty is useful, that the treaty provides us with some leverage in terms of opposing Nicolás Maduro, but at the same time, we have to be pragmatic and realistic in working inside the body of the state parties. Secondly, when I raised initially the migration problem out of Venezuela, it was never in my mind to imply that we see Venezuelans coming into our countries as a threat to our countries. That is not entirely the case. What I was saying is that we have to look at the root causes inside Venezuela. Why are these people, this enormous amount of people moving out of Venezuela? David Smolansky, who heads a working task force in the OAS on the migrant crisis, can provide us with some additional thoughts on this question. But in no way Brazil has never looked at this situation and has tried to securitize the migration problem. What we see is the need to support those people moving out of Venezuela. Colombia has been extremely generous. They have over almost 2 million Venezuelans living in the country. Brazil, just as a measure of comparison, Brazil has 200,000, so you can see the difference. And it's been enormously important for Colombia to address this issue. So I think that in moving forward, we need to continue building the alliance around the idea that we have to apply additional pressure. And I think we will be able to do so. But we can never look at the last of the measures available in Article 8, which is the use of force. Not even the naval blockade or the no-fly zone. I think we need to move very carefully in proving, first and foremost, that the treaty provides us with a way to apply political and effective measure against the regime.
Great. Thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador Brownfield, any last comments before we open?
Nope. I'm actually quite comfortable with exactly where we have come out here.
Okay.
And the description you've heard is, it is a legal document. There is some flexibility within that document. And the simple human law of logic suggests the Rio Treaty can be applied only so far as the states party are willing to apply it. And that means you must have some degree of consensus in terms of which parts of the treaty and the sequencing that will occur. And Ambassador Simas has said it perfectly in simple mathematical terms. 13. If you can't get to 13, you're not going to apply the terms of the Rio Treaty.
Okay, just to clarify, Ambassador, we have 13 countries. I understand 16 approved the September resolution.
Right.
And that resolution excluded Uruguay, Trinidad and Tobago, and Cuba, right? Because 16 plus these 3 countries are 19, which is a total of the member countries. Who out of those 16 didn't vote on the December resolution? Just to keep in mind what countries are now dropping from the September.
Panama, República Dominicana.
Panama.
Dominican Republic, and
Argentina. No.
no.
Okay.
Huh? It was absent.
Trinidad was absent.
Trinidad and Tobago was
Yeah.
absent.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Now, Moses,
Yes.
we have to, since you wanted clarity,
Yes, yes.
I think that was one of the objectives that you mentioned when we started. There's a lesser number of votes here. It's because those countries that have decided to abstain this time had issues with the legal application of the measures inside the national legal systems.
Oh, interesting.
So they were very careful. Even Panama even added a footnote to the resolution to explain why they have decided to abstain. Nevertheless, they continue to be siding with us in terms of using the treaty to apply pressure on Venezuela. But they have problems of how these would impact the legal systems. And you can imagine why, right? Panama and Dominican Republic.
Interesting. That's a good clarification, especially on sanctions too. I am aware many countries in the region has different legal barriers, no, when it comes to applying sanctions on Venezuela. So it's good to be mindful of that. Okay, thank you all. I just need your name, affiliation, and remember the question always ends with the question mark. Just go straight to the question. I'm sure we're gonna have enough time to cover many of your questions. I see a hand on the middle there. I see one here too. So let's do two at this time.
Hi, Sonia Schott with Schott International Consulting in Hit Media. Okay, it's very clear that the U.S. has been a driving force or a leading force trying to find out a solution to the Venezuelan crisis. On the other hand, Latin America is being more cautious. I would like to know what will be the middle point or the comfort zone for both sides. And more than that, what will be the lessons to be learned? Because today is the Venezuelan crisis. Hopefully not. But what will happen if something similar or worse happen in the region? What will be the regional response to that? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. We have one here.
Thank you so much, ambassadors. My name is Simon Molina Herrera. I'm a member of Youth and Democracy in the Americas, a new organization funded by students. So my question is for the three ambassadors, what would be enough proof from the regime that the Rio Treaty could be enough to send military intervention, and why won't be enough or not a correct time to send the force by now? I know that you already answered most of my questions that I had that I'm really grateful for, but I would like to know what would be the mistake of sending force through United Nations or the Rio Treaty at this time right now?
Thank you. Thanks for the question. Okay, we have two questions. We have three speakers, so feel free to jump in either one.
Okay.
Sure.
With your permission.
Senior ambassador.
Not as a diplomat. Well, for me as a Venezuelan ambassador to OAS, there is a very big problem. People in Venezuela, people who are suffering a tragic situation, used to see, and that's one of the misconceptions that Ambassador Sigma exposed in his first intervention, that the TIAR is a solution, that the TIAR is going to decide the use of force, and it will be very simple. You are to hear trumpets and drums, and Maduro is going out. And as Ambassador Sigma also said, you need the approval of 13 countries. And when we started to talk about convening the ambassador in order to discuss TIAR, we had 4 or 5 people who were absolutely agree absolutely with this idea. The majority was very reluctant. And we started to talk and talk and talk and talk, and we arrived to 16 votes. And 5 countries, as Ambassador Sigma recalled, are very, very against the use of force. And you need these 5 countries in order to have 13 votes. That's the problem that most people doesn't understand. And a lot of people talk to me and write to me and say, what are you doing? You're not doing your job. Why the international, multinational invasion is not yet here? If you had a more convincing power, the problem should have been resolved months ago. But you see now, which is the obstacles we have in front. And the problem is not so simple. You are asking people to send troops to Venezuela. It's very easy to say that, but think of the possibility as you are the president of a country, and they're asking you to send your boys to eventually die, or maybe dying in Venezuela. And that's not an easy decision. That's in this way of thinking, there are lives in risk, but you have an economic cost. An invasion is not a very easy way of acting for a country. And there is another thing very important, is what is the idea of the Maduro regime for every country? It's not the same. We here spoke about Maduro in the same way, but if we had invited here all the ambassadors, or 34 ambassadors in the Permanent Council of the OAS, we should have heard about people who say, well, this is not a very efficient government, they have problems, but it has been elected in election that some people recognize, but other people don't recognize, and they had problem, but the problem is every country has problem, and the only way is to wait for next election. And if you say that the election of 2018 was a fraud, they say, well, but we have the possibility of waiting to 4 years more in order to do another election, and to try to have very fair and just election is still open. And you see why this is not absolutely not easy to have the support. I spoke of 34 members of the OAS. The TIAR members are less of that, but we need 13 votes. And the discussion is very easy. There are not 13 votes right now, and we are very far from that in order to start a military intervention.
All right. Any other reaction? We have a question about what's the middle ground between the U.S. and regional positions on Venezuela.
I mean, let me offer 2 or 3 points. First, and I insist upon this, ladies and gentlemen, the year is 2020. It is not 1920. When one talks about military options in 2020, one must not look at the problem set as though it is 1920. I do not believe anyone, at least anyone who is sane, who is capable of thinking and reasoning, is suggesting that an international military force should land upon the beaches of Maiquetía and begin to march up the highway to Caracas. I have heard no one make such a suggestion. I have heard people suggest that if the humanitarian situation, if the number of refugees, if the complete and utter breakdown of social order in Venezuela reaches a state where truly there is risk of millions of people dying, that then we should open the door to consider other options. But no one is suggesting the 1920 option that I am aware of, which gets me to the questions, the suggestion one of what would be the conditions, or the second question, which I'm going to relate to it, which is really the first one, what is the difference between, in a sense, the U.S. approach and the approach of governments and nations elsewhere in Latin America? Watch 2 figures, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm going to be fairly brutal about this, and I apologize because the one Venezuelan who is sitting here, well, there are two of you, I suppose, so I apologize to both of you, because the figures are in the worst days of the United States Civil War, what Lincoln called the terrible arithmetic, which is to say, how many people must die before finally the other side agrees that we should stop this conflict. And if you apply the terrible arithmetic to Venezuela on the part of the Western Hemisphere's governments, it is how many people are going to be dying inside of Venezuela from malnutrition and starvation, from lack of medicine, from lack of housing, electricity, running water. At what level does that reach a point where the Western Hemisphere says we simply cannot tolerate this in our hemisphere any longer? And at that point, what are the options available? The second number out there is how many refugees. Now it's connected, obviously, to the first number, but what is that number? We're now somewhere between 5 and 6 million. The overwhelming majority are in the Western Hemisphere. Is 10 million a number that we finally say enough is enough? Is it 15 million, one half of the population? At some point, that will have an impact. It will be felt most immediately by the neighboring countries, of course, one of whom is represented here on the panel with me. The other is not, but I bet there's a Colombian somewhere here in this audience, who are the first that will have to address the issue of their own citizens saying, we have reached a point where we cannot absorb more without some form of international response. Watch those two numbers. That would be, in my opinion, what would bring the U.S. position, which, by the way, I'm not certain is that different from that of many Latin American nations, but the other regional nations together at some common middle ground. And that, in turn, would be, in my opinion, what would get people to say, okay, we're not talking about an invasion, but is there something that can be done that has a military component to it that would address in some way the humanitarian crisis of Venezuela? That would be my response. I'm sorry I went on so long. I'm finished now.
Oh no, I mean, this raises a question, Ambassador. I'm sorry, but haven't we passed that threshold with all these numbers that we're seeing on refugees? In terms of people dying, I mean, they're not official numbers, obviously, but we've seen a lot of children having a lot of malnutrition issues. But I'm going to leave that question on the table. I want to hear from Ambassador Simas. Any reactions so far?
I think when we hear Ambassador Brownfield talking about the terrible, what was it?
The terrible arithmetic. Was what Mr. Lincoln used to call it.
Arithmetic. And of course, it's difficult and it's painful for all of us discussing numbers in such a cold way, you know. What is the number? What is the number of migrants and refugees that we are able to support before something else needs to be done, you know? That's why I try to look at this issue from the other angle, from the other perspective. How much more are we able to support inside of Venezuela in terms of this brutal regime attacking its people, violating human rights, and basically being the cause for the expelling these large numbers of people, you know. We continue to have an open doors policy toward the migrants and refugees, and there's nothing recently that I've seen that would change the way we address this question. Of course, the pressure is increasing for Colombia in particular, but I guess we will not change that one bit, you know. I think the problem resides inside the regime, and we have to attack the regime in order to get things changing. Now, you raised the point, which is a legitimate one. I understand your question. However, we are still bound by the fact that we need to build this coalition of support for other measures other than the ones that have been adopted so far. But I entirely support the view that we have not precluded resorting to other measures which are allowed under the treaty, and that's why we are convening the foreign ministers every 3 months in order to consider the situation in Venezuela. We have had one in September, one in December. We're going to have the next one in March. And I think that we'll continue to look at this question under the premise of the urgency that it raises.
Thank you, Ambassador. Just another connection here with another international treaty, Ambassador Tarra, that we have discussed before at CSIS is the application of R2P. No? I mean, this raises the question, if those numbers are, meets the urgency that requires a different response, how is the R2P applies to the responsibility to protect? No? And if you read the treaty, there are 4 different requirements that have to be met before the international community, including the UN National Security, the UN Security Council. So that raises a question about the role of R2P, which I know Secretary Almagro has led, an international movement to discuss at least the application of R2P in Venezuela. We have time for one more round. This time I will take 3 questions if there are 3 questions in the forum. I see one hand there, I see David Smolansky here, and then I see another hand over there on the back.
Hi, my name is Kate, and I'm with Facebook here in DC. My question is for any one of you. Basically, I wanted to know the ways in which you would try to entice former members of the Rio Treaty who, big economic powers like Mexico who were former signatories of the treaty but no longer are. What are some ways you would entice them to join, especially now in the fight against the Maduro regime in Venezuela? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. We have one here. Just pass the microphone in front of you. Yeah, thank you.
David Smolansky. I'm OAS Secretary General Envoy for Venezuelan Migration and Refugee Crisis. Well, this is a very good forum, so congratulations CSIS and Moises for this, and Ambassador, thank you. Just has been mentioned a few times or many times about the refugee and migration crisis. I have to share with you that already are officially 5 million Venezuelan refugees. And I think one important declaration that has to be worked with TIAR is the Cartagena Declaration, which Brazil is implementing, and I have to congratulate with that. Cartagena Declaration says that a person is a refugee when flees a country because of general violence, human rights violation, a public alteration, and a foreign occupancy, foreign intervention. All of them right now applies for any Venezuela that is fleeing the country, including the last one, specifically when Maduro recognized just 24 hours that there are at least 23,000 Cubans in Venezuela. So when I say this, to the implementation of Cartagena Declaration that Brazil is doing, is not only because it benefits refugees to give them permanent protection, but it's probably the only way that we have right now in the international community to recognize that in Venezuela there is a conflict that has been created not only by a conventional dictatorship, but a criminal state. Because 5 million people that have fled is only behind Syria. So I just wanted to add that and a specific question to Ambassador Simas. Have you been affected recently for on the border or any part of Brazil because of the illegal mining that has been increasing in Bolivar state through not only the armed forces but irregular groups? And in those irregular groups, specifically the ELN, has Brazil been affected also by the presence of ELN at the Bolivar state? Thank you so much.
Thank you, David, for the question. We have one more on the back. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Daniel Chang. I'm a USF student. I'm just here in training and in USF and the US House of Representatives. So my question is that many of you said, Ambassador Brownfield, Ambassador Simas, that the treaty is a legally binding document as one of the main advantages of it. However, what happens when one of the signatory countries decide to have a political change of mind and not apply the resolutions that have been declared by the treaty. For example, I'll use this specific example. On the December resolution, Jorge Rodriguez was included among the travel ban. However, a week later, there was a change of government in Argentina, and Jorge Rodriguez was in the inauguration of now President Alberto Fernandez. How does that alters the integrity of the treaty, and what should we do?
Good question. Thank you. Ready. We have 3 important questions to address. I think Ambassador Tarre, I'm gonna end with you. Let's go to the illegal mining question, Ambassador Simmons, if you don't mind, how the illegal mining is affecting Brazil. And if you can, each of you address those questions in 2-3 minutes each, that would be great.
Yeah, well, I know, thank you, David. I know that David has been looking into this question. Of course, all of the compounding effect of illegal activities in our border is a source of concern, obviously. And illegal mining is one of them. Affects rivers, affects populations, affects public health, and it's a source of concern. I wanted to address also the other question in the back. I'm sorry I didn't get your name, but thank you for the question. The fact that the treaty, all of the decisions are mandatory except for the ones that involve the use of force. That is one of the provisions in the treaty. So, but other than that, the decisions that are adopted need to be enforced by it's a legal obligation of state parties to enforce. I do not want here to dwell into the reasons why Jorge Rodriguez was welcomed as head of delegation in Buenos Aires. That's not really up to me to answer. It's for Argentina, but I think the fact that we adopted the travel ban is important. And even in Argentina, Ambassador Tarre, if I'm not mistaken, the new Argentinian government has denied credentials to an appointee of the Maduro regime, Estela Lugo, if I'm not mistaken. So it's important that even now, Argentina is abiding by the decision we took on the designated individuals in the resolution. And to complete your question, you see, in order to deal with the migrant situation in Brazil, because also of the scale of the migration into Brazil, which is much less than Colombia, we were able to put together an operation, and I strongly recommend that you read a very recent report by David Smolanski, which is available on the webpage of the OAS, that deals with the way Brazil has answered to the question of migrants and refugees involving our territory. We have been able to put together an operation involving organizations like the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and the International Organization for Migration. We have had support from bilateral countries also, including the United States. And we were able to put in operation a system that allows these Venezuelans to arrive in Brazil with the minimum quantum of dignity, and they have been documented very, very quickly. We have applied the Cartagena Declaration, and so we have, in a way, Venezuelans coming to Brazil have at least 2 or 3 different options in which they can decide to stay in Brazil, to work in Brazil, and to have access to health and education services in Brazil. All of these aspects are reflected in David Smolanski's report, which I recommend to your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thanks. Okay, we have 2 minutes for each, ambassadors. I'm going to start with you and then end with you, Ambassador Tarre.
Okay, 2 quick points, if I could make to the first and the last of the 3 questions that we took. The first was what additional steps could be taken with some of the larger and yet more skeptical nations on application of the TIAR, the Rio Treaty, and I believe the 2 examples that you offered up were Mexico and Argentina. And I'll offer you a diplomat's response to that. And I would say there are ways, most of them done in private consultation, sometimes public messaging, to have dialogue among governments and nation states. one way is to appeal to humanitarian instincts. I mean, the point that, in a sense, we're making today is that this is not necessarily a political, ideological, or philosophical issue. This is an issue of tens of millions of human beings who are suffering from malnutrition, bordering upon starvation in places, and complete and utter lack of public health. Is this not a route into reconsideration? A second, more fundamental issue is, as a result of those that humanitarian crisis, tens of thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands of more refugees will arrive in your countries themselves. To what extent do you believe that this constitutes an internal political issue for you? And third and finally, and this is the former diplomat in me speaking, one has to try to understand what are the concerns of the government that is not participating at this point in time. Now, some of them may be fundamental, and you're simply not going to be able to address those. But others may be matters of language, if we say it in a different way. If we add an element to whatever the decision is, would this be enough to bring at least your government into some aspects of application of the Rio Treaty? This, ladies and gentlemen, is why we pay huge sums of money, I can say that now because I no longer am receiving any of it, to professional diplomats in the hemisphere to try to find ways to reach a common position. And finally, the last question answered, and I'm going to be very quick on this one, what do we do about governments that have in fact endorsed or in a sense voted for application of certain aspects of TIAR, but then choose not to enforce them? This is not the first time in human history, ladies and gentlemen, in which this has occurred. When it occurs, you have both private and public dialogue. You also have to accept that governments, including my own, which I no longer work for, but I receive a miserable pension from, who will at times pick and choose those obligations that it will in fact accept and enforce. At the end of the day, there's a certain amount of moral persuasion and to a certain extent naming and shaming. If a government has in fact endorsed and accepted a certain obligation, international obligation, and then not complied with it, that at least should be drawn to the attention of the world at large. And with that, I stop so I would hear what I'd much rather hear, and that's Ambassador Tabre offering much better and more expert positions.
Not as a diplomat. This part of the discussion reflects the complexity of the problem. Not only the legal complexity, but the political complexity, and the changes that are operating in the political situation. First of all, two of the biggest, most important countries of the continent, Canada and Mexico, are not part of the treaty. Then government changes. Argentina voted in favor of the last of the two resolutions, but the last vote was 3 days before the change of government in Buenos Aires. And that reflects the difficulty of applying a treaty that one country votes just before leaving the Casa Rosada, and the new government who enters and is legally linked by the treaty, but doesn't apply in all the extent what was resolved then, allowing Jorge Rodriguez to enter in Argentina. But we have the change. There are a lot of changes. Uruguay, who announced that it was retiring from TIAR, they announced the treaty, and we are out of this. But it's changing in less than 2 months. We are going to have a new president in Uruguay, and I am not sure what President Lacalle is going to do, but it's very probable that he's not going to get out of the TIAR. And there is a new government in Bolivia, and that makes changes. Ecuador, who is not member of the TIAR, has not the position that it had in the time of Correa. That may adds a new complexity, but as Ambassador Brownfield said, there is no way to enforce what the treaty commands. But there is a moral obligation, there is a legal obligation, and diplomacy has a lot of ways in order to deal with this kind of limitation and this kind of problem. It's absolutely not easy, but it's that we have.
This has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much, ambassadors. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to the Americas program to putting this together. Thank you.